Okay, so I'm gonna welcome Jim Joseph to our community today, and give folks a little bit of time to join the call. I see some more people coming in. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael Diamond. I'm the academic director of the Integrated Marketing and Communications Department at NYU School of Professional Studies. And as I think most of you know or may know, we run probably two of the largest marketing and PR programs at graduate level in the country, MS in integrated marketing and an MS in PR and corporate communications. And we're also blessed to have wonderful faculty like Jim, who I'll introduce in a moment. So one thing, just a little bit of housekeeping. This is going to be mostly a conversation between Jim and I, at least initially, and then we'll invite questions from the audience. Obviously, at any point in the discussion, if you want to put in a question which you'd like us to address, we can do that, and just use the Q&A function at the bottom. The chat is, I think, disabled for this call, but if you use the Q&A function, you'll get through to us, and I'll try and curate and organize the questions as we go. And we welcome any and all questions. And then the second thing is, Jim has very generously agreed to donate and gift 6 copies of his wonderful book that we're going to be discussing today. And so 6 folks from the audience will be randomly picked, and you'll hear from Jim directly. So that's, it's not quite Oprah Winfrey level prizes, but certainly another way to extend the engagement, and we appreciate that from Jim. So without further ado, Jim is the global president of BCW, a communications firm. He also has responsibility for their Latin American operations, and recently was announced as the chairman of the PR Council, which is the trade institution, the trade group that represents PR agencies. He has worked extensively with brands throughout his career, J&J, Walmart, McDonald's, etc., and won all of the sort of prestigious awards one could hope for in life. But I think he'd also be the first to tell you that perhaps the most important honor and appellation he's received is being called a dad. And coming a couple of days after Father's Day, or a week or so, we celebrate with him, wishing happy Father's Day. And he's written very passionately and honestly and openly about that experience of fathering. And then finally, I would say, just by way of introduction, Jim is also an adjunct instructor at NYU's School of Professional Studies in our integrated marketing programs. And so it gives me distinct pleasure to welcome Jim and to know he is a colleague of ours. All right. So Jim, let's chat a little bit about your background and how you started out in all of this, and just get a sense of what makes you tick, and how you got to a point of writing this wonderful book, The Conscious Marketer.
Sure. Hey, and thanks for having me, Michael. This is awesome. Students are very important to me. I love teaching. I've been doing it for 10 years now with NYU. So a shout out to everybody out there. I can't see you, but it's great to be with you this morning. So I was one of those kids. I don't know why, but I was one of those kids who kind of always knew I wanted to go into marketing. I would read the breakfast cereals, at the cereal boxes at breakfast, and I only paid attention to the print ads and magazines. I just always wanted to go into branding and marketing, and never really understood what it was until I actually started doing it, and started my career at Johnson & Johnson in brand management, very classic packaged goods marketing, worked in skincare and oral care and baby products. And then kind of realized as I was going through my career that I thought the agency folks were having more fun. I liked the creative process. I liked the writing. I love the ideation. So I switched over to the agency side, and through the years have run advertising agencies, digital, promotion, CRM, and now have been at Burson Cohen Wolf, I should say, for just about 9 years, a little under 9 years, running communications. The truth is, it's really all very similar. The disciplines have blurred through the years. It's all about building brands and building businesses and engaging with your your customers. So it's all good stuff.
Well, yeah, and I think that's a a whole debate in itself, and something you and I have talked a bit about the merging of the industry itself between marketing and PR and whether that really matters and how the turf is divided up. But I think it's fair to say that your message, even though the book has marketer in the title, is very much about communications broadly. I wanted to ask you, for those of us coming to this work fresh, you're sort of coining a new term, this idea of conscious marketing, and you make a distinction in the book between sort of conscience and how that operates and the word conscious, and for those of us who are sort of struggling, okay, what's the difference between those two things, and why it really matters? Like, how do you square those two terms in your mind?
Sure. Yeah. The very essence of being a conscious marketer is having a firm and deep understanding of what's going on in the world around you and what's going on in the lives of the people that you are trying to target, ultimately your consumers or your customers, but really understanding how the world is affecting them, your role in the world, and essentially what's going on, and marketing accordingly. So marketing with a consciousness. That is very different than having a conscience, and spelling is really important there. It's not about good or bad or right or wrong or left or right. It's not about any of that at all. It's just being aware and having it affect in a positive way how you market it so that you're being more effective in your marketing.
Yeah, I'm conscious too, though, that you do take a bit of a position on being right and wrong, and I wonder whether this idea of the positions you take does matter at some level about whether you can distinguish marketers who are kind of using their conscious power to do things that perhaps their conscience would tell them differently.
Right. Well, yeah, and I think what matters most is what matters to your consumers. And I'm going to use consumers broadly to also include customers and even other stakeholders. It's whoever is consuming your brand or your communications or your marketing. And yes, I mean there is a conscience in there, but what matters is what matters to your consumers. So if the values and beliefs and opinions on social issues are important to those consumers, then they need to be important to you, and they have to line up. Because if they don't line up and they don't mirror each other, then you're not going to be able to engage them in a way that's going to add value to their lives. And ultimately, that's what it's all about. Brands that add value to their consumers' lives are the brands that win. And the only way you can do that is if you're conscious about what's important to them. And yes, having a conscience fits in there, but it is a little bit different. And you may not, as a person, you may not necessarily agree with those stands or opinions or beliefs on social issues, but if they're important to your consumers, then they need to be important to you.
And it feels very much, Jim, like part of a broader movement or a discussion. And I wondered if we could spend a little bit of time talking about some terms that are out there. So there's this whole idea of purpose-driven marketing, and you spend a decent amount of time in the book talking about marketing purpose and marketing purposefully. I mean that's sort of one idea. The other is this sort of broader movement around, I think some people call it stakeholder capitalism or compassionate capitalism, the stuff that they've been talking at Davos about and the Business Roundtable published. How do you see those things linking in, and what's your particular lens on all of that through conscious marketing?
Sure, and I think that has changed pretty significantly in the last 3 or 4 months with the pandemic, the likes of which none of us have ever experienced, and even more recently, the global outcry for racial justice, which is not new by any means, but it's taken on a new level and a new level of action, which is really kind of great to see. So what we've seen as a result is purpose, which I often say had a capital P, which was very lofty and very aspirational, and things like sustainability and environmentalism and climate change, which are all super important. Those issues are not going away by any means, but they have been sort of paired up and replaced in some ways with purpose with a small p, things that are much more tangible, much more immediate, like, access to basic healthcare and employee safety and supply chain as it relates to the food industry, for example. I mean, these are the things that brands have very purposefully focused on in the last 3 or 4 months because we're in crisis mode, and our consumers need our help to provide those sort of basic services. So the notion of purpose, I think, has become much more personal and much more tangible. And brands just need to be purposeful in what they do. That, just going out and selling a product or a service and promoting it, nonstop is not necessarily providing a purpose or not necessarily really adding value to people's lives right now. Sure, your product or service is probably useful, but what you do with it and what you do with your marketing and communications can actually add a lot more value than just the product or service alone.
Yeah, and I think this notion of the big P purpose and small p purpose will resonate with a lot of people. A lot of marketers I speak to, very well-intentioned people are sort of struggling with this idea about, does every company need a big P purpose? And, what if I don't have one? Am I somehow a bad brand? But, I think you're drawing the distinction actually has made this a lot more concrete. What role do you see CMOs playing in all of this then? I presume that some of that focus on the small p purpose informs or should relate to the big P purpose of the brand. What role do you see marketers playing in moving the company in these directions?
Well, I think in a very tangible kind of way, it's about really thinking hard about your marketing budgets and where you're spending your marketing and communications dollars and to what purpose, literally. And we're seeing kind of across the board, CMOs, CEOs, both, diverting their funds towards things that actually really truly add value. For example, I'm working on a number of brands that have shifted funds away from more traditional advertising, away from more traditional promotion and sort of selling, and into things that like help local businesses and help small businesses and help people thrive in an economy where they perhaps might be struggling. That's very purposeful from those CMOs to divert their funding. And we're also seeing, which I found to be kind of inspiring in the last 3-4 months, CEOs, and I talk about this in my book too, and the book was written before the last couple of months, CEOs and CMOs have become kind of the voice of the brand, and they're becoming the spokespeople, and they're representing their employees. And that's a relatively dramatic shift. It was happening before, but now it's kind of happening en masse. And consumers and people are looking to hear what the CEO or CMO has to say. And what are the stands on the issues that we're all going through that the company's willing to take. And not just talk about, but actually put action against. And that's been a quite fascinating phenomenon where you're seeing CEOs speak out on behalf of the company, on behalf of the employees, and on behalf of the brands on some of these social issues.
Yeah, and I want to explore the downside of that in a little bit, but maybe we could take 1 or 2 examples. You write about Starbucks a decent amount in the book, and as an example, I think specifically of this idea of the CEO voice. And you can talk a bit about what you see Starbucks doing well, or other brands, examples of how they've really put that into practice. They've instantiated this idea of what you're talking about.
Right. Starbucks is a great example because I think they're a first mover. And what we've also seen in the last few months is that those that go first get the most credit. And yes, we should be altruistic in what we're doing in terms of helping people and adding value, but at the same time, these are businesses and they need to conduct a business. So the fact that they're getting credit for it is helpful. Builds brand loyalty, builds brand reputation, probably builds business. So Starbucks was an early first mover, tackling social issues, well before it was thought to be okay for companies to take a stand on a social issue, either because folks thought they had no right to do it, or it was too risky and you might alienate people and you might get a boycott. The Starbucks folks were out there first, and they were talking about, gay marriage and gun control and race relations at a very early stage in all of this. Now it's becoming the norm. You know, it's almost like you have to, because people are demanding that they want to know where you stand. But they were one of the first. And I will never forget, because I thought it was so incredibly motivating when marriage equality was kind of on the brink of either not happening or happening. And the Starbucks CEO at the time in a shareholders meeting basically said that he was supporting marriage equality and domestic partner benefits, and, you know, putting programs into place for his employees who are part of the LGBT community. And he basically said, if you don't like it, sell your stock. And I thought that was so motivating, so inspiring, so bold, but also right. And, you know, that they were among the first to do that. And their business, you know, that's not the only reason why their business has thrived, but clearly their business is doing pretty well.
Right. So let's stay on those positive themes for a while before we go dark. But you know, when I read the book, you have this lovely sort of call out to the millennial generation, and I think this idea about essentially the millennial mindset should inform our psyche. You know, that's the way to think about these things. And I was thinking about this in the context of whether you think at some level there is actually a new form of sort of activism that's emerging. You know, for those of us in big public companies, we've been used to this idea of shareholder activists, you know, who either show up at meetings or take a large chunk of stock, you know, and in the broader sphere, you know, we've obviously got you know, Greta and other young activists. But do you think there's actually an opportunity for young people to play a role in brand activism? Do you see any evidence that, you know, this millennial mindset, and it's even probably generations that come after of millennials, but, you know, that there is a real brand activism forming at all?
Absolutely. There's brand activism and there's also employee activism, and they're probably fueled by one another. I think that we're seeing a dramatic increase in employees demanding to know where the company stands on certain issues, how the company is treating its employees, it's choosing its suppliers, making its decisions, spending money on programs, understanding what the brands stand for. I mean, we're seeing pretty massive employee activism, and even, you know, stating whether or not they want to work on certain projects within the company because it either mirrors or doesn't mirror their own personal values. And I think hand in hand with that is brand activism for sure, and consumers driving that as well. Employees are driving it, but also consumers, where they want to know where brands stand. They want to know how they're spending their money. They want to know what programs they're supporting, and they're making brand choices as a result. And then as a result of that, brands are making their decisions accordingly because they know they're being viewed and judged and commented on and chosen one way or the other. So it's through that brand activism, and we're seeing it just recently in literally the last 2 weeks with race equality. You know, brands speaking up and not just making statements, but actually putting things into place for their employees as well as in the marketplace to drive change, which is something that we haven't seen before. We've seen statements, we've seen policies maybe, but we haven't seen like we've seen lately.
And is there evidence in your experience that, you know, brands have either won or lost based on some of this activism? You know, I'm both silver lining, you know, and believe in the, you know, the humanity and its very good side, but I'm also skeptical often about human behavior and whether people, you know, if they want that you know, chocolate, or they want that plastic toy or whatever it is, whether they'll really change their habits based on what they know and understand about the employee practices or the, you know, materials and where they're sourced and how they're sourced. So, you know, have we seen examples where people have really hit the wall because of this kind of, you know, lack of consciousness or conscious marketing?
Well, interestingly, back in the day, you know, when I first started my career at J&J, for example, we would never, ever make a comment about a social issue or take a stand on a social political issue for fear of boycott, because you knew on some level you're going to alienate a huge portion of the audience. So we just avoided it. And even those that did, maybe at the time, they were kind of put in their place kind of quickly, like, we don't need to hear your point of view on that. That's not something you should comment on. As I was saying, now it's become almost a requirement, in many cases a requirement. And it's not so much that you get punished when you make a statement or you put something into action, as much as it is you get punished if you don't. You know, staying silent is pretty much not an option anymore, particularly in the last couple months. But and consumers go after companies, more so companies probably, but companies and brands that haven't spoken up and haven't done anything and haven't helped contribute to a solution. And those that have spoken up and put things into action, I think there's a lot more tolerance now for making small mistakes. Like, you might not get it perfect. In fact, you won't get it perfect. You're probably going to stumble a little here, a little there, but that's part of the journey. And as long as your intention is right and you're trying to come to a solution, you're trying to contribute, you're going to get a lot of credit from consumers. But to your point, it is a form, and I talk about this in the book, it is a form of targeting in a lot of ways. Because when you take a stand on a social issue or contribute to something going on in the world, you are going to get those who agree with you to align with you. And you're going to hopefully build brand loyalty and brand reputation, and they're going to think positively about your brand. Those that don't agree with you, it's probably not going to work with them. So in a way, it's a form of targeting. But I think that's just part of business, is targeting, and understanding who is best suited for your offering, and then targeting them and aligning with them so that you add value for them. So I think it's just part of the process.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's where the rubber hits the road, probably, for a lot of these brands. And, you may be addressing some of the complexity here, which is, how do you feel about certain brands whose values, and you talk in the book about, being true to your values as a fundamental driver, really, of how you go about doing this. And we'll explore in a minute, I think, a bit more about, the practical advice you give brands. But what about those brands whose values perhaps you personally don't agree with? There are lots of issues out there. Chick-fil-A's position on LGBTQ issues, other brands who've taken a position or not taken a position on gun rights and gun ownership and things like that. How do you square, perhaps as a conscious marketer, the idea that there are brands out there who are using their power and their voice? Because I think that's part of what you're telling us, is you actually have been gifted this power and this voice, using their power and a voice to promote causes or concerns perhaps that don't square with your personal or positions or politics, etc.
Interesting debate. I'll answer it on two fronts, but I'll say one thing first. There was a study done not too long ago, but it was pre-COVID, amongst millennials, that basically said millennials not only expect brands and companies to contribute to fixing things in the world, but they actually expect them to do better than governments. And they're not even looking to governments actually to fix some of those problems anymore, because they realize they're not going to. But they are going to rely on companies and brands and organizations to do it, because they have the resources, they have the funding, they have the employee base. So that's a real reality check when you think about the things we're going through, that most consumers don't expect that government's going to be able to fix it. So they expect companies to. But to answer your question, I think, I'll answer it personally first, and then I'll answer it as a marketer. I think personally, for me, when I see a brand or a company that does not align with my values, I reject them. I mean, I personally will not go to a Chick-fil-A. I have not been to a Chick-fil-A in years. Before I realized their stand on things, I was a big fan, and I very quickly changed my behavior. And I could think of many examples where I chose to reject a brand because on, gay rights or marriage equality or gender inclusion or anything, that I've walked away as a person. And I'm not alone. There's lots of people that make their decisions based on that. As a marketer, though, it's less about my personal views on social issues and more about my consumers' views on issues. I should be aligning my brand to their views on the issues so that I can add value to their lives. So it's not about me as the person, it's about my target audience. And you have to separate those two. It's not about what you think, it's about what your consumers think. Now, if what your consumers think doesn't align with you personally, then probably go need to find another job.
Yeah, and so that ties back to your employee question, which is, ultimately as an employee, is that where you want to work? I guess that's
Right.
the calculus you have to do. I would assume, in essence.
Yeah.
I think that's really a fascinating trade-off that I think people probably have been making for years, and now are making it more explicitly. And I do think this point about employee activism is one of the more powerful pieces of all of this. And maybe that was a function of a fairly positive labor market, i.e., that people had ability to choose. And we might not see the same level of scruples or discernment. Now, unfortunately, that the economy is taking such a hit. People
Right.
just need to get a job and work where they can to feed their family, etc. But it clearly, all the surveys I saw, similarly showed this employee activism, or to your point, employees looking to their own companies to solve problems that they don't think others can solve. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the dark side. You do talk in your book about what you call dangerous territory, and I think you talk about Dolce and Gabbana, and some sort of missteps they've made. Are there areas that you would say they're off limits? There's a famous concept in political science called the Overton window, and it's the subjects which you can and can't talk about, and they apparently shift over time as society's mores and habits change. But is there dangerous territory for any brand in terms of any specific issues?
I think there is, and I think it varies obviously by brand and by organization. But when you enter dangerous territory, when you're entering something that your consumers don't care about, or it's not important to them, or it's not a priority, or you enter dangerous territory when your point of view is different on a topic than your consumers, or you enter dangerous territory when you comment on something that has absolutely nothing to do with your business and probably even nothing to do with your consumers. And I pointed out Dolce and Gabbana because this was a few years ago. They made comments about in vitro babies and that kind of thing. It's like, what does a fashion brand have anything to do with how people conceive their babies? I mean, that just has nothing to do with their business model. And arguably, they probably didn't check into what their consumers thought about it because there was massive backlash. So that's dangerous territory. And that's where you'll get comments from consumers, from the media, from other stakeholders, where it's like, why are you commenting on that? That has nothing to do with your business model. And there's certainly plenty of things that do have something to do with your business model, or that are important to your employees or important to your consumers, and focus there. Focus where you can add value. And that's where employees have become increasingly important. In a world now where we have to think about employee safety and access to healthcare, and they're isolated at home and their well-being might be in jeopardy. Putting your employees first and making sure that you're focusing on what's important to them keeps you out of dangerous territory.
Right. I'm going to just start encouraging folks to pitch questions if they would like. The Q&A is open, and as things come in, I'll keep an eye on those. We'll keep the conversation going, but I want to make sure that we get some audience participation here. So it's definitely you might just have a whole bunch of fans out there who are hanging on your every word, Jim. But hopefully we get some critical questions too. So one of the topics I think we as both I want to talk a bit about sort of practical marketing advice, especially perhaps as it relates to some of the small brands or early stage brands. What very practical counsel or wisdom are you giving? Let's say I'm a small brand and I come to you and I say, Jim, I need your help. I don't know what to do about this BLM thing. You know, I know it's important and I feel instinctively it's important, but what should I do? What does that advice look like, especially for some of the smaller brands perhaps who don't have the resources, at least, maybe not at that stage where they understand their consumers quite as in depth or innately. So,
right. The first thing we say to every single client, big or small, and we've been doing it, I don't want to say around the clock the last few weeks, but it feels like around the clock the last few weeks. The first thing we say to them, regardless of industry, regardless of size, is where are your employees on this issue? You know, start with your employees and prioritize your employees and find out how they're feeling, find out what's important to them, find out how they want to participate and how they want to, you know, spend the energy and resources of the company. Start with your employees. They are your most important asset, and their comfort and their security in a sort of well-being kind of way, and how they feel about working for your organization should be the number one priority, because they're actually the asset that you can use to then go externally as well. So start with the employees, and then we also say do an inventory. You know, what has been your past activity and past, you know, attitudes and statements on this topic. If you had never said anything, if you've done things, if you haven't done things, take an audit of what you've done, and also take an audit of your resources. You know, what do you have in your arsenal that you could put into motion? You know, is it money? Is it resources? Is it skill sets? Is it space where you could hold events? Is it, you know, what is it? And think broadly about it. We typically just think about money in these cases. Well, I have this much budget. Well, no, but you have employees, you have their skills, you might have parking lots, you might have rec rooms, you might have a lot of different assets that you could use to help mobilize some action. So those are the first two steps. And then, you know, once you know what's important to your employees, you use that as your guide. You know, on the issue of Black Lives Matter and race equality and other gender equality and LGBT, which is what we're talking about a lot this month as well. You know, start with your employees. That's the most important place. And they will guide you on how to navigate it. And don't just, we've been saying this a lot, you can't just release statements. That just does not work anymore.
Right.
Because we've done that forever, and it's gotten us no progress. Well, not no progress. We've progressed, but not as fast as I think anybody would want to. So how do you turn it into action? What can you do? And that's probably not even money related. It's more resources and programs and policies that you can do to make change.
Yeah, I think one of the most trenchant criticisms I've seen recently of some of the BLM reactions was, you know, this point about it's all very nice, you know, having advertising campaigns and speaking, but you know, if the senior members, and the example is Nike, you know, which arguably is probably one of the better, you know, in terms of its capacity to talk about these issues. But the point that the critics, I think, have made is, but, you know, where are the people of color in the senior ranks of that organization? Where are the people of color on that board of directors? And if you, and I guess my understanding is if you really want to take a position in the case of, say, social justice or racial relations, you need to be anti, you know, the negative, anti-racist, not just, you know, signaling that you think positive. So, you know, one of the students, actually, possibly one of your students, Olivia, is asking, you know, are there examples that come to mind where brands not only, you know, perhaps I'll ask it in a different form, where there seems to be a mismatch between what they say and what they do, I guess is the question.
Yeah, I don't necessarily want to call anybody out per se, but I think we have seen lately a lot of brands and companies that are just releasing statements, but they're not driving any action, and they're not driving any measurable action, so that a year from now we can look back and say, okay, how did we improve? Yeah, in a measurable kind of way. We're still seeing a lot of companies that make a statement, make a donation maybe, that's helpful. That's a step in the right direction. But, you know, what else are you doing to drive change? And we were just talking this morning on another webinar about, how do we make sure that this isn't just yet again another cycle? We've been through these cycles many, many times where we all get upset and we're all like, this has to stop. And then for some reason, it just sort of dwindles and we go on. How do we get that how do we stop that cycle? This isn't a news cycle. This is actually something that has to change. And one of the things that we were talking about that I firmly believe in is that it's got to be multidimensional, obviously, but it's also got to be through leaders who are going to put change into place. And that can be leaders that are Black, that can be leaders that are people of color, that can be leaders that are gay. I'm gay, but that part doesn't necessarily matter as much as long as it's people that are going to put in change. Now you need a diverse group, you need diversity, you need inclusion, you need people of color, you need Black people, you need gay people, you need all sorts of people on your leadership team so that you're getting it right. But the point is you got to have leaders that want change and are going to drive it. And that, I hope, as an eternal optimist, I hope that's what's different this time.
Yeah.
That's what I'm feeling. I feel it, and I hope that it's true.
Yeah, I think I'd build on that though and say we shouldn't allow that to say, oh well, somebody else is going to drive this change for us. Yeah. So, I worked at Time Warner for many, many years, as you know, and Jeff Bewkes, who was the CEO at one point, was fond of saying, leadership can come from any place. Yes, yeah. It's not just some privileged group of people calling themselves the senior leadership team. So, I think that's a thing certainly to encourage students to think about themselves as leaders in these issues. We had a very interesting question, actually. I think probably many of us in leadership positions struggle with, which is how do you recommend a brand prioritize communicating on all these different social issues? So, I think all of us just about as we were trying to figure out how to work with our employees and our consumers and in our case students to go through COVID, and now having to rethink and make sure we're appropriately responding to BLM and the issues of racial justice. And again, to your point, those issues never went away. They're not new, but there certainly is incumbent upon marketers perhaps a way of thinking about how to prioritize and balance those things. Any thoughts about how you do that, how you advise people to do that?
Yeah, because you obviously can't do everything, and you certainly can't do everything all at once, because then nothing really has impact. So the challenge is to very carefully choose what's going to drive the most change and what's going to have the greatest impact. And that's where I'll say again, you start with your employees, because you can have your greatest impact as an organization with your own employee base, and take a hard look at the makeup of your organization. From senior leadership, absolutely. Is that a diverse and inclusive group? All the way through the teams and through the people that you're recruiting in the door. And make sure that, yes, is it a diverse and inclusive group, but also is it an environment that allows diversity and inclusion and allows it to thrive? Because it's one thing to recruit and it's another thing to retain and have people thrive. So number one priority should be employees. And then beyond that, in terms of like external programs, I think you prioritize the things that will have the greatest impact, and that are this is going to sound funny to say it this way, but are the easiest for you to do. Like the easier it is for you to put it into place and to implement, probably the more successful it will be. If you try to do something that's so complex and so out of your wheelhouse, even if you think it'll have great impact, if it's not within your own skill set as an organization, you're probably not going to be successful. So take a hard look at what you can do as an organization. What are your skill sets? And then pick the things that leverage your skill sets that can be implemented with success and that have impact. And that's a different answer for every organization.
Yeah, it sounds like the old adage, I think, from Google about done is better than perfect.
Yeah.
And and working on things that you can get done before you sort of over engineer the solution.
Yeah.
You had talked, I think, or we briefly touched upon in the discussion about stakeholder capitalism, about the sort of this broader leadership or organization that the integration of various different functions. And we had a question here from Ken Kerrigan, also one of our esteemed professors at the school, and a PR maven like you. He asked a question about investors who have been looking at so-called ESG stock portfolios, and arguably a lot of young people were attracted to these portfolios of stocks where they were curated and picked because of their positions on social issues.
Yeah.
How much do you see, or would you encourage the sort of investor relations sides of the house and the marketers in a company to really be thinking about these things? It's a different form of positioning, positioning a brand for investors, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, you have to look at your entire stakeholder, I call it ecosystem. Stakeholder capitalism is kind of the term now, which I get. I think of it as an ecosystem. And I also think of it as anyone who consumes your brand. That's why I call them all consumers, because investors are consuming your brand, suppliers are consuming your brand, your customers, your consumers, your employees, suppliers I may have mentioned, like they are all consuming your brand. They are all engaged in it, and they are all important stakeholders in your brand. So, investors and shareholders are immensely important. And I think while financial metrics are still going to be a key determinant in where investors place their money, they are much more savvy now about choosing things that they know align with their values. Partially because I think they think it's good business, because those are probably businesses that are going to do well. If they're contributing to society, if they're driving change, if they're powerful forces in culture, then they're probably going to be more successful. So they're going to be a better investment. But yeah, you absolutely have to consider that entire ecosystem, and you have to be consistent. You can't change your brand for one stakeholder group and then represent yourself differently with another, because it'll get called out, it'll be criticized, it won't be effective. Because a lot of those stakeholder groups might be some of the same people. Your employees are probably shareholders. Some of your shareholders might be suppliers. I mean, it's like it's an ecosystem.
Yeah. No, and I think we've certainly seen some of that in these companies run as house of brands, where you might actually have brands which potentially conflict. I think the example I can't remember exactly was a deodorant where people considered some of the advertising quite sexist, and yet another brand was positioning itself as much more socially woke with respect to feminism and women's issues, and they were called out that you can't have both sides. You got to figure that out if you're going to as a corporate brand. So
right.
We had a couple of questions, interesting questions. Let's take a sort of an international take, or maybe it's a question about the repercussions of taking a position as much as anything else. And this is from Michael Durand, and again another one of our professors and distinguished colleague of yours. He asked about the idea of sort of how you reconcile company values in the context of an international setting. And the example he's proposed is the coach of the Houston Rockets, who took a lot of heat about tweeting something about pro-democracy protests in China, and then the government of China suspended sponsorships and telecast deals, etc. And so I think that's a case that many of us are familiar with. So I think the question there is really, how global perhaps can you, if you're a global brand, and you clearly need to take a certain position in the country, in one country, how does that impact your business elsewhere? How do you think about that?
Well, I think that's consciousness on the international level. If you're going to be an international company or an international brand, an international leader even, you have to be conscious of the cultural variations around the world, and you have to have those affect your decisions. They may not change your decision. You might still, in that particular case, you might say, I'm still going to take that point of view and that action, but you need to do it consciously. And you need to do it knowing how your employees are going to feel about it, how those local market customers or consumers or stakeholders are going to feel about it. You have to do it consciously. You have to understand what you're doing and enter it with full knowledge. Again, it might not change your decision. It might change how you do it, though. And at least it will allow you to think through the ramifications. I mean, you shouldn't be, gone are the days where you should be caught by surprise by how somebody reacts to one of your programs. You shouldn't be caught by surprise. That's not consciousness. you can't know and predict everything, certainly, but you should have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen if you take a stand, or you put a program in place, or you're not being conscious.
Right. So so in a way, it's sort of depending on the size and the scope of the brand, you know, that level of consciousness scales essentially. And yeah, I mean, clearly a tough juggling act, though. You know, to pass the things.
Well, it's a good. It ties back. I'm sorry. It ties back to the Starbucks example of the CEO who said, "I'm supporting marriage equality, and if you don't like it, sell my stock."
Yeah.
I don't know the particulars of that sports example, but that might have been a conscious decision of I don't know if I care if I lose my sales in that part of the world. That's something I'm willing to give up on because I believe strongly in this other. That's being conscious. Right.
I want to take a couple of questions together that are really, again, questions I have, I think, which is, and we led a panel at the PRSA Tri-State this time last year, or sorry, in the fall last year. And, you know, one of the questions that came up was, does every company need a purpose? You know, and that was the context there was discussion about purpose. The questions coming in here more around sort of taking an issue, you know, Mark Sommelet, another one of our profs and former executive at Colgate, senior colleague at Colgate Palmolive, and Laurie Green, another adjunct instructor, you know, have some similar questions, I guess, about and one of our attendees, Anton. So sort of pulling these themes together. The question essentially is, you know, either does a brand have credibility to speak on every issue? You know, so do you find yourself caught up in this trap of like, oh, I've got to comment on every issue? And the second thing is, you know, what happens when you don't take a stand on certain issues? Can you sort of weather the storm? And then a final sort of coda to this triplet is, you know, social media is such a broad amplification that you know you're going to get negative reaction. So one, do you need to have a stand on every issue? And two, you know, how do you deal with the sort of negative blowback?
So I would say you not only don't need to have a stand on every issue, you can't have a stand on every issue. It's endless if you try to take a stand on every single issue. What you should do, though, is be conscious of the issues that are important to your stakeholders, your consumers in the broad sense. What's important to them? And is it important to them that you do take a stand? And if you're going to take a stand, then it's got to have action behind it. So that's where you should think about it. Is not, do I need to have a stand on every issue, but what are the ones that are the most important that I have credibility with, that I can do something about? And those are the ones you focus on. Because there's so many that would be, you know, so out of left field, because they might not just relate to your business and your consumers. And so focus on the ones where you can have impact. That's where it counts. And I would argue that it's really hard to stay silent anymore. I think that, you know, for a while that was a good model, I suppose, is just, you know, don't worry about it. And then there was a model for a while of, well, I'm going to do stuff about it, but I'm not going to be public with it. I'm not going to communicate it. I'll be humble. I can't tell you how many clients have said, I'm humble. I don't want to brag. It's not bragging. It's not bragging. It's talking about what's important to your consumers and showing them that you think it's important too, and that you're trying to add value. So I don't think you can stay silent. That doesn't mean you have to have a voice on every single one either, though. And that also doesn't mean that you have to be, like, you don't have to solve the problem. I think that's part of what people struggle with is they think as a company and as a brand, they have to solve it. You're probably not going to solve it. If it were that easy, then somebody would have done it already. Right. But you can contribute to the solution, even if it's in a small way. Every little thing is contributing to the solution. And if everybody does their part, then it probably will get solved at some point. It's not going to be overnight. It's a journey.
Right.
Talks about that. But I think that's what inhibits people sometimes is they think, oh I can't solve that. Well, just do your part and then do a little more and then do a little more and then do a little more. That's the key.
Yeah.
And I think I forgot the third part of the question.
Well, we can. One was about negative blowback, but let's come back to that. But there are. I want to stay on this idea of words and action, perhaps, and what you say and what you do. And there's a couple of comments. In fact, there was a nuance even to Mark's question, which and it was picked up by Yanis, one of the participants in the conference, who's asking a question more around how you avoid seeming self-serving or even hypocritical. So, the example Yanis is using in the case of, Aunt Jemima, that's recently, chosen to change out its old logo or brand, is, that's an issue arguably that's probably been known to them and they've been aware of for many, many years. So are they simply, and again, you don't have to comment specifically about that brand, but, what's the danger that, you're seen as simply being, just responsive to the latest thing, and it doesn't really reflect a genuine feeling or genuine commitment. Again, that I presume that's a concern for you as someone promoting conscious marketing.
Yes, and there's a few layers to that. One is, and we've gotten at our clients a lot of them have said that to me, Jim, I don't want to look like I'm being opportunistic. I don't want it to look like I'm trying to sell something when people are suffering. And my answer to that is it's intent that counts, and it's context that counts. Should you be advertising and talking about how great of a brand you are? Probably not. That would be opportunistic. But by developing programs that are helping to drive change, that's not being opportunistic. If it happens to sell products along the way, that's not being opportunistic. That's contributing to the solution. That's being a part of the community. That's being human. And you should get credit for it because consumers want to know what you're doing. So I don't view that as opportunistic at all, provided it's adding value. Now, hypocritical is a whole nother thing because you have to be consistent as a brand. So if you are publicly doing something to support an issue, and then internally you're not supporting that issue either through words or action or both, then that's being hypocritical. And I would argue that's where I talk a lot about, put employees first, like get your house in order before you start trying to solve it externally, or at least do it concurrently, and be honest about it. You're not hypocritical if you're honest about it. And a lot of organizations lately, and I think they are feeling that they have permission to say, listen, we haven't solved this yet. It's ridiculous that we haven't solved this yet. We've been trying, and but we're really actively working on it. And that those folks get credit for honesty, because the truth is nobody's perfect in any of these topics. Nobody. And I think that the minute that brands and organizations and leaders realized nobody's perfect, just say it, and then move into action. That gets rid of the hypocriticalness, if that's even
right. Hypocrisy.
The hypocrisy, yes. Thank you.
You can't invent more than one word in a semester. So I want to sort of, we're coming towards the end. We've got 5 minutes or so left. I want to ask you a question, perhaps a polemical question, and then we'll end on some questions about building capabilities, both as professionals and for small companies, brands. The polemical question, I guess, is about this recent boycott of Facebook advertising, and Facebook is a bogeyman for lots of different issues, but at the same time, this just compelling force of nature in which we all know we can reach lots of consumers. So, how do you feel about that movement? Is that an effective way for advertisers to work with media? Does it mean the money just shifts to other venues like Amazon or others that may equally be freighted with issues or concerns about data and stands on radical groups, etc.? So how do you feel about what you see going on now with Facebook and the moving of money out of social media?
So a couple of things. I have my own personal opinions about it, but I'll comment more as a marketer. I think that brands have to be conscious, I'll use that word, but also purposeful in how they choose how to engage with their consumers. And they need to choose venues, vehicles, avenues, whatever word you want to use, touch points that will reach their consumers effectively, and that are in spaces where their consumers are and where they want those brands to be. So Facebook happens to be one of them, great. If it shifts to other things, that's fine too. That's just good media planning. So if it makes sense for a brand not to advertise on Facebook, then I don't think they should. If their consumers don't want them there, if their consumers aren't there, if the consumers don't like the content that's there, let your consumers be your guide, is my marketing point of view. But at the same time, I will also add to that, one thing that has kind of inspired me in the last couple of weeks to really think about things is that it's not enough, this is the quote that a lot of people say, it's not enough to not be racist. You need to be anti-racist. You need to be actively out there stopping racism as a person, as a leader, as a brand, and as an organization. There's a lot of stuff on Facebook that I'm not comfortable with personally. So, and I've called things out personally because I now need to be an anti-racist, not just not racist. So if that is a way for a brand to actively say, I'm not just not racist, I'm anti-racist, then they should do that. That's their
right.
Their
That's
role.
that's an action they take.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's we have a couple of minutes, so maybe see if you can offer your thoughts in a minute or so, and then we'll wrap up about either small companies with less of a budget. Really, how do they get a better understanding of their customers, their consumers? Retooling marketing is one question, and I'm going to join another question which relates, which is, and you may want to settle on this one, which is, as a number of people on this call, and obviously our students are emerging professionals in this field, what are the kind of capabilities, unique capabilities, you think people should be building to be a more conscious marketer? So what do you feel is kind of fresh and new here in terms of individual capabilities, or perhaps it's more of the things we teach already but just need to be emphasized? So.
Sure. So I'll answer the first question first, which is if you're a small business, I think that's where social media is your friend. You can learn a lot, and you can listen a lot, and you can follow a lot of your consumers, whoever they are, on social media, and you'll see what they're worried about, how they're living their lives, what they're struggling with, and ultimately how you can add value. So social media, social listening, social monitoring should be your tool of choice. Big business or small business, but particularly a small business because it's not that much money to learn. So that would be my quick answer to that. In terms of skill sets that you need to bring to the party, if you will, we were just talking about this the other day. The PR Council started this agency-ready certificate program where we've got, I think it's 4,400 students and graduates taking this program, and at the end they'll get a certificate that basically says you're ready for an agency job. It's actually really cool at a time when summer internships are not as prevalent and getting entry-level jobs are really hard. So this came up in my session, and I said, I used to talk about creativity, and I used to say that creativity was really important. And I don't mean the ability to draw or write, although it includes that. I mean the ability for creative thinking and creative problem. I used to say that was the most important thing. And it's still important, but I think it's table stakes. I think what's the most important thing, and is a differentiator, and for those of you on the line who also sat in my session for the PR Council will know that I said it's empathy, and I wrote about it in the book too. You have to be able to put yourself in other people's shoes if you're going to be successful in a career in marketing or communications. You have to understand your consumers and what they're going through, not what you're going through, but what they're going through. Not your belief on a certain issue, but their belief on a certain issue. And if you're going to work effectively in teams, particularly when everybody's home and on video, you've got to have empathy. You've got to understand, wow, my coworker also has little kids at home that they're homeschooling, and they've got a spouse at home that they're sharing bandwidth with, and they're feeling trapped and isolated, and like empathy. Empathy is the most important differentiator, I think, now, to determine your success in this, I think in any field, but in this field in particular.
Okay, well, I think that's a wonderful note. We like to end on a high note. Jim, I want to thank you personally
Thank
for
you.
your wisdom and counsel and collegial mentorship and that to our students. And I'm sure I join all of our students if they could, and faculty and friends of the school who've joined the call in thanking you for your time. And
Oh, thank you.
I want to re-mention that we will be offering the book as a gift to 6 lucky winners, but I wouldn't discourage anybody else going to Amazon and clicking on the book and finding the book and link and purchasing it. It's a really good read, a good summer read if you get some time at the beach. So many thanks, Jim. All right,
Okay.
bye
Bye-bye.
for now.
Thanks everybody.